They measle-mouthed it. And Morell admitted this once he was under oath, that it was solely to help Joe Biden, to give him a talking point in the upcoming presidential debate. First of all, an elderly man with no prior convictions, no history of violence. When the FBI raided his home, it looked like the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, right? Crazy. I mean, when they want to get you, look what they've done now to Eric Adams in New York.
Yeah.
Although he's wishing he never criticized the Biden administration right now.
What is happening ultimately? I want to ask about the Hunter Biden letter, the 51 intelligence agents who signed this Hunter Biden letter that was apparently identifying the Hunter hard drive as disinformation. And then we learned that that was not actually true, right? That there was actually Hunter Biden's laptop. We also saw the DOJ protecting Hunter Biden, a total different standard that's happening here. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what's going on? Is this an institutional problem at the top? Is this a political problem from a couple of the key leaders? Because we're here and we often will cover FBI meetings and DOJ meetings. The Attorney General will come into Congress and ask for more money. FBI director will come in and ask for more money, but we don't see the CIA come in and ask for more money. And so we're trying to get our bearings straight on how this is all, working. So I just vomited a lot of stuff out there, but anyway.
No, I get it. What I can tell you is it's worse than you think.
Okay.
And in my book, I have a quote from the French philosopher Voltaire, who I happen to be a fan of. And Voltaire once quipped that anyone who can get you to believe absurdities can get you to commit atrocities. And I apply that to the Democratic Party because they have gotten their adherents to believe in absurdities. The Hunter Biden laptop was not Hunter Biden's. Walls don't work. There's more than two sexes. You can't define the word woman. Biden is the smartest guy in the room. And Trump is an existential threat to democracy. I could go on and on and on. The absurdities that they have gotten their people to believe. And then Voltaire's logic was that once the faculty of the mind has been dominated, from then it's a slippery slope down. And so you could get them to commit atrocities. And so the people, and this isn't just political appointees, it's career people in the FBI and DOJ who wield a great deal of power. And you know better than anyone how much power a federal prosecutor can wield. They just became tainted, right? And they started to believe the BS. And I trace this all the way back to 2016, when Hillary Clinton was supposed to be a shoo-in. They were all planning the coronation. They were hanging the buntings. And then all of a sudden, this Trump guy came along like the Grinch and stole the coronation. They were in despair. And I live in D.C. D.C.'s 92% for Joe Biden in 2020. Right? I'm surrounded by Democrats. It's a stronghold for the Democratic Party. And my neighbors were in deep despair. They were in shock. And while they were down and in shock, the Democratic Party just filled them with hatred and fear and just hate-filled rhetoric. And they became poisoned by it. And they came to believe that, the ends justified the means. As long as they were going to get Trump, it wouldn't matter, right? It doesn't twist the laws, twist the facts, do whatever you have to do. It's all justified because you're getting Trump. And they just lost it, and that's what I saw happen. And it's across the board. And, back in 2016, at least back then, when they were unlawfully targeting the Trump campaign, back then they were using intelligence collection authorities, right? Like FISA warrants and they're under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. At least back then, they had the decency to try and hide what they were doing. Nowadays, from the raid on, they're acting openly as an enforcement arm of the Democratic Party. And the way you're able to do that, again, is not only do you have the political appointees on board with doing it, but you have a high-level careerists who have a great deal of power who think that it's okay as long as they get Trump. And look what happened back in 2016. The FBI leadership got wiped out. Comey got fired. McCabe got fired. He was the deputy director. And then there was Lisa Page and, Pete Strzok and others. They all drank the Kool-Aid. They fell prey to the hatred and it warped them.
Yeah, we see a lot of that. And I remember we read the transcript, I think it was Mike Morell from the ex-CIA director who sat down for that testimony with the House and basically said the same thing when they were questioning him about the conversation with Anthony Blinken and providing Biden with those talking points. And so I think there's that quote, I think it was from George Carlin, or maybe he got it from somewhere, that you don't need a conspiracy when you have common interests and people are working together because they just don't like Trump, right? It's kind of to get Trump. And there are a lot of forces at play to do that.
Yeah. And I know many of the people who signed that Hunter Biden letter. There were like 51 of them. I know many of them. Yep. They're all hardcore Democrats, right? That's the common thread between them. Right. You're either hardcore Democrats or just Trump haters. And the language of the letter is very finely wordsmithed.
Very,
right?
Yeah.
Oh, it has all the earmarks of a Russia disinformation. They don't say it is, right? And so they measle-mouthed it. And Morell admitted this once he was under oath, that it was solely to help Joe Biden, to give him a talking point in the upcoming presidential debate. And it worked, right? It worked.
It did work. And I think it's an unfortunate thing. I think it's, as more and more people are learning about it, I think it's wrecking the credibility of our institutions that we can't rely on them to come out and give us an honest shake. And I think think Trump is the victim of a lot of this right now. And he is fortunately strong enough to weather the storm. But I mean, anybody else getting prosecuted for something like this, anybody else that has the book thrown at them and has the entire DOJ and FBI and all these agencies orient themselves, I think is going to get steamrolled.
Yeah, in my book, again, I trace it all the way back to 2016, right? And so first we have what I call the Russia collusion hoax coup, because it was more than a hoax. It was a soft coup. And then we had the persecution of General Flynn, Trump's national security advisor. Then we had the persecution of Trump's close friend, Roger Stone. I mean, do you remember when the FBI raided Stone, first of all, an elderly man with no prior convictions, no history of violence. When the FBI raided his home, it looked like the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, right? Crazy. Then you go forward to the impeachment hoaxes and then to the J6 kangaroo court. It's one attempt after another to politically assassinate Trump. And then when they couldn't politically assassinate him, they created conditions that would permit a physical assassination of Trump. Now, do I think, they were planning an assassination? No, I don't. But they certainly were not willing to provide resources that were adequate to protect Trump. They were declining requests that were made for additional security. And the only reason those requests were being made is because they needed to be made, right? And so on the one hand, they were not permitting adequate safeguards to protect Trump, while on the other hand, they were whipping up, through violent rhetoric, all kinds of passions that are not healthy for the nation. Oh, and one thing that's often forgotten is while they were declining to allocate the resources that were necessary to protect Trump, Benny Thompson introduced a bill into Congress. This is H.R. 8081 to remove completely Trump's Secret Service protection. Think how vile that is, how depraved that is, because the only reason he has that protection is to protect his life, and not just his life, his wife and his kids. I mean, how depraved. Can you imagine if the Republicans had introduced a bill into Congress to remove Barack Obama's Secret Service protection? Those Republican legislators would likely be rounded up, handcuffed, and on a plane flight to Gitmo, courtesy of Merrick Garland. And then they'd be indicted for some, collusion, conspiracy to murder former President Obama. They'd be down at Gitmo getting bread and water. And the water they'd be getting would be on a declined board with a cloth over their face.
Right. Yeah, well, I think in some maybe subconscious, sick way, they're telegraphing what they want to happen. And I hate to even say that, but there were way too many people who were making inappropriate comments after the first assassination attempt and the second assassination attempt. And the second assassination attempt with this Ruth fellow, Ryan Ruth, he was traveling back and forth to Ukraine. And what ends up happening in a lot of these situations, and I'm guilty of it myself too, is when anything unexplainable goes on, everybody just says, oh, it's the CIA. CIA did it, because it's, a nice convenient thing to say the CIA did it. And it really explains a lot of things that we don't have good explanations for. But with Ryan Ruth, right, we're asking ourselves, okay, is the CIA involved in Ukraine? And this guy's really affiliated with Ukraine. He's coming back and forth, and he seems, gets reported to Homeland, or Border Patrol reports him to Homeland. They let him go back and forth and go through. What are you seeing with these things? I mean, I'm sure you can't say, yes, the CIA did it or something like that, but what's your perception on what's happening with these other incidents? Is this random, or is there something else going on?
I'm not a big conspiracy theorist because I've worked behind the scenes and I've been on the receiving end of those types of accusations. And I always laugh and I think to myself, wow, first of all, they think there's people in the government smart enough to plan that and pull it off. Well, yeah, that would be nice. And then two, even if the government was smart enough to plan it and pull it off, you think they could keep that a secret? If there's more than two people involved in something of that nature, you ain't keeping that a secret. That's going to leak. So for that reason, I'm not big on the conspiracy theories. And I know that often the explanation is just government incompetence, right? But especially when it comes to protecting Trump. And so that's how I would see it, just incompetence. It is inconceivable to me that that guy was not on everybody's radar, right? Intelligence, law enforcement, everybody, all over the radar.
Right. Well, that's why we're all scratching our heads saying, what the heck, man? I thought like all these agencies were there to identify these people in particular. This guy's got like 100 felonies, and then suddenly he's in the vicinity of Trump.
Here's one thing that nobody focuses on. It is very difficult, and this is purposeful. It is difficult to target United States citizens for collection with intelligence authorities. And that's purposeful. And the rules on that, they're published. That's Executive Order 12333. It's on the public record, right? And so it's difficult to target U.S. citizens with intelligence collection authorities. Now, I can't speak to the law enforcement authorities. That wasn't my bailiwick, but I would imagine they have, well, for the most part, they have probably similar restrictions. They got to be careful. But then look what they did when they want to do it. Like, look what they did to Roger Stone, to Michael Flynn. I mean, when they want to get you, look what they've done now to Eric Adams in New York.
Yeah,
I'll bet
yeah.
he's wishing he never criticized the Biden administration right now.
Well, and I'm wondering about, like J6 too. I understand your point about the government being incompetent. I think we see it. We can all experience it. I worry about the weaponization of incompetence as an excuse for when bad things happen. Oh, we couldn't put someone on the roof, and it's very slopey, and it was hot that day. And come on, come on. So if it's incompetence, in certain domains, the Secret Service shouldn't be incompetent in that domain. It's kind of their primary deliverable is to make sure people don't get shot.
Right.
And so it feels like an easy scapegoat. And then we see other situations where in January 6th, where we know that there were a bunch of undercover people there who were part of the government, part of intelligence agencies. We know it. We covered the Proud Boys trial where they stipulated and admitted that there were 8 federal agents there. There were only 5 Proud Boys there. And we also saw that I think the defense was trying to also admit something like evidence of 50 CHSs there. And so if we can't even get evidence, we all saw this event happen, and they won't even tell us what really happened there with all of that other things. I think that's where people get skeptical that maybe some of these conspiracies can happen and that something else more complicated can just be buried by all the power at play.
It reminds me of a story. I worked with an old FBI agent who'd been around forever, to include through the 60s and 70s when they were targeting the anti-war protesters. And he told me a story of when he went to an anti-war protest meeting. There were about a dozen people and 10 of them were government undercover people at the meeting.
Yeah.
So, yes, it does happen. I don't know anything about J6 specifically.
Yeah.
All I needed to do was see the photographs of the people around that day. I could pick out those people. It wasn't hard. So yeah, there is something to that. So we covered generally, the conduct and then how the investigations were unfair. Oh, let me cover just one more thing from the investigations, because this is fascinating. When the FBI finally did search Biden's house, of course, with Biden's private lawyers and White House counsel president, they found a top secret document, and Biden's private lawyers informed the FBI that they did not have consent to take it. Think about that.
Well, yeah, that's
and
nice.
then the White House counsel, a senior lawyer from the White House counsel, traveled from Washington, D.C. up to Wilmington to take possession of the document. He took it from the FBI. Have you ever heard of a White House counsel lawyer inserting himself into the chain of custody for a critical piece of evidence in a criminal case? No, it's ridiculous. You couldn't even imagine that something like that could happen, but it happened. There's many other instances where the investigations were handled just completely differently, right? Everything in Biden's case was voluntary, right? The searches, there were no subpoenas, there were no search warrants, no grand jury. Oh, Biden's private lawyers, even though Biden's private lawyers were permitted to rummage through the crime scenes, they were not questioned because, and the special counsel Herr said this, he said, well, that would have required me to get into attorney-client communications, so I couldn't ask him those questions, which is actually correct, right? A prosecutor should not be able to get in between the confidential communications between, someone who is potentially a defendant and their lawyers. But that's not what happened in Trump's case.
No,
in
it's
Trump's
not.
Case, yeah, they went quickly to legal compulsion, subpoenas, search warrants, grand jury, and then they hauled Trump's private lawyers before the grand jury and forced them to divulge protected attorney-client communications. Now, they got a court order to do that. It's an 87-page opinion from Judge Beryl Howell, and I spend 3 pages criticizing that opinion because it's horrible in my book. So that's the investigations in a nutshell, how unfair they were and how disparately they were handled. Then you get to the charging decisions, and nothing for Biden, right? This is a guy who stole classified information for half a century, had it all over his house, was completely reckless, knew he had it, because one of the pieces of evidence that the special counsel obtained was an audio recording of Biden talking to his ghostwriter in February of 2017. So he'd left the White House. He was now a private citizen working on his book. And you can hear Biden say on the recording as he's coming up from the basement, I just found all the classified stuff downstairs. Now, any prosecutor would call that a taped confession, right? It would be a star piece of evidence, but that's not what DOJ did. What they did was they said, well, he was so senile at the time that he likely forgot, right after he found it, he probably forgot that he found it. They also, and this is the best part, special counsel Herr then said, I also don't think many people would put much weight onto an 8-word utterance. Can you imagine that? I mean, in a murder case, what if a prosecutor has a tape where the defendant says, I just killed him? Well, that's 4 words. I don't see them dismissing that because it's too succinct of a confession. It's ridiculous, right?
Right, totally.
Yeah, but they did that. There's many other reasons. I call them all the get out of jail free cards that they dealt to Biden. And I go through them all in the book to include, ones that really irritated me because all my Democratic friends would throw this in my face. Oh, but they're very different because Biden cooperated with the process.
Right. The obstruction. Right. That's the argument.
And I said, well, what process was that? The process that Biden's own administration came up with to investigate Biden? Yeah, right. And then then I, list 7 ways to pierce the myth of cooperation. Biden refused to answer questions from the special counsel. Refused to answer. That's not cooperation, right? Refused to give consent for them to take documents that they found. That's not cooperation. And there are many, many other instances I give in the book.
And they were very sneaky about it. They were not forthcoming about it, right? We learned about it like days after it happened, and there was weird stuff from Karine Jean-Pierre at the White House, and nobody really knew what was going on. Then all of a sudden...
I lay out the timeline in my book of what happened when, what they told us, and how what they told us turned out to be a complete fabrication and a lie. Yeah. They kept it off the public record for months. I mean, after they first found classified documents belonging to Biden, they kept it off the record for months. And another thing is, we still do not have total accountability for what Biden stole, because even the special counsel never gave us a total number. Now, I added them up in the appendix, and I got to about 130, but there's other things like there was a stack of note cards that were highly classified. They just call it a stack. Biden's private lawyers took 9 boxes from the Penn Biden Center and sent them to Boston. We still don't know what was in those documents. Wow. And so I suspect Biden had hundreds of more classified documents than has been put on the public record. But he gets off scot-free, right? No charging decision, nothing. And then you look at what they did to Trump. It is unbelievable, especially for someone with my experience. And I've worked on cases with real spies, and we charged them with 1 count of espionage. 1. Trump had 32 counts broken down into individual documents. I'd never seen that done before. So that's how they got 32 felonies, by breaking them down and charging per document. I'll remind you, John Deutsch's case, he had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of classified documents. He got charged with 1 document, secret, on a misdemeanor, but not Trump. And Trump was president, for crying out loud, with more control over classified information than anyone. And also, everything in that indictment is so devious. They even fuzzed up the timing. Now, obviously, the White House has got cameras around it. They know when those documents got packed into boxes and put it onto trucks. But the way they say it in the indictment is, upon departing the White House. Well, the first thing I thought was, while he was still president or after? Now, it was while he was still president, but they don't want to say it. They don't want to say it because it tubes their case, because that's a presidential action at that point, and he's going to have immunity for that. Everything in that indictment is so devious. I'm just scratching the surface of it, but those are some of the big ones.
And those are great, but I did find it interesting that the Biden administration certainly knows how to appoint U.S. attorneys as special counsels, given that they did that with David Weiss, who was prosecuting Hunter Biden, a U.S. appointed attorney who was confirmed by the Senate, and the same thing with Robert Hur. And you actually talk about Jack Smith in the book. I think you detailed that Jack Smith and his wife made the documentary for Obama, Michelle Obama.
Yeah, I call it the infomercial, Becoming. Yeah. I refer to Jack Smith as the great expansionist, the maker of chains, the crusader of conservatives. I'm a government attorney, so I look at regulations. And so the DOJ regulations are published at 28 CFR. So I looked them up, because the regulations for appointing for Merrick Garland or the AG to appoint a special counsel, they're on the public record. And so I looked them up. And Jack Smith doesn't even meet the standard. I mean, Merrick Garland violated his own DOJ regulations, because the regulations say you should appoint someone who has an established history of properly interpreting and applying the law. Well, that's not Jack Smith. Jack Smith was rebuked unanimously by the Supreme Court, even the liberals on the Supreme Court, for the expansive interpretation he took on the fraud statute in order to prosecute another Republican, the Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. And in the Supreme Court opinion said that Jack Smith's interpretation of the law had no basis in text or history. That's not a guy who should be appointed as a special counsel. So I would argue that Garland even violated the DOJ regulations, apart from, the constitutional arguments.